What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. This week on Not Your Average Meta, we're bringing you one of the most interesting games we've ever filmed on the channel, featuring our first ever Rule Zero commander. We'd also like to shout out our second full-time channel sponsor for Season 3 of the Hobby Horse. If you're ever in the Central Illinois area, be sure to stop in and check out the store as well as saying hi to Martin. This week's matchup features Foil playing the Brothers War Alchemy commander Rusko Clockmaker, Gavin playing the original OG OP Vampire commander Edgar Markov, Fogral playing his Toxic deck being led by Ria Ivor Bane of Bladehold, and Eric returning playing his 4-color Omnath Locus of Creation deck. Now that we're fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Eric plays a Boro Palace in the Clouds and then pays 1 to cast a Ruin Crab. Foil plays a tapped Sunken Hollow. Gavin plays a Swamp, then casts a Dark Ritual in order to create a 3 black mana, which he then uses to cast a Necropotence. He then pays 4 life in order to draw 4 cards, and then he passes his turn. Fog plays a Terramorphic Expanse and then he cracks it to go get a Plains from his library. Eric plays a Sacred Foundry, paying the 2 life to bring it into play untapped, which has each of his opponents then milling 3 cards while he casts the trade routes. Foil plays a Command Tower and then casts an Arcane Signet. Gavin plays his Sulphurous Springs, then pays 1 for a Springleaf Drum, as well as paying another 1 for Vampire the Dire Moon, which creates him a 1/1 Vampire token when it enters play. He then pays 3 more life to draw 3 more cards while he passes. Fog plays an Isolated Chapel for turn and then casts a Talisman of Hierarchy before he then casts a Prosthetic Injector. Eric doesn't get a land on his upkeep, so he taps his Aboro in order to use its ability to bounce it back to his hand in order to replay it again, milling his opponents for 3 more cards. Foil plays a Clearwater Pathway for turn and then casts a Commander Sphere, which he then uses to help cast a Baleful Strix, which has him drawing a card when it enters play. Gavin plays a Plateau for turn and then casts a Sanctum Seeker, which has him creating another Vampire when it enters play. Gavin then goes to combat, swinging his Vampire the Dire Moon at Eric, which has him losing 2 life, while each of his other opponents each lose 1 life apiece. He then pays to put 3 more lands into his hand and then ends his turn. Fog plays a Swamp for turn and then casts an Ichor Rat, which has each player getting a poison counter, before he then pays 1 to equip the Injector to his rat. Eric misses another land drop, so he uses the Aboro Palace in the Clouds trick in order to play Aboro as a land for turn and mill each player for 3 more cards. Foil plays a Swamp for turn and then pays 4 in order to cast his commander Rusko the Clockmaker, which creates him a Midnight Clock when he enters play. Gavin draws and then plays an Urborg for turn before he then pays 2 in order to cast an Impact Tremors. Gavin goes to combat, swinging his Vampires at each of his opponents, which has each opponent losing 4 life, before Foil then blocks with both of his creatures, killing both of Gavin's tokens, and Eric takes the rest of his damage. Gavin then pays 3 more life to put 3 more cards into his hand on his end step. Fog plays another Plains for turn, and then goes to combat, swinging his rat at Gavin, giving him 4 more poison counters. Fog then pays to cast an Indoctrination Attendant, bouncing his rat back to his hand, which then creates him a 1/1 Might token. He then pays 1 to equip his rat with his Injector and pass his turn. Eric once again misses a land drop and decides to bounce his Aboro back to his hand in order to replay it, to mill everybody for 3 more cards. On his end step, Foil casts an Opt in order to scry 1 and draw a card. This then has Foil adding a counter to his clock and each of his opponents losing a life while he gains a life. Foil draws for turn and then plays an island, before he then pays in order to cast Ashiok Dreamrender. He then targets Gavin with his Ashiok trigger, having him mill 4 cards before he then exiles each of his opponent's graveyards. Gavin plays a Vault of Champions for turn and then tries to cast an Overloader Dam, which then gets countered by Foil with an Arcane Denial. This then has Foil gaining a life while each of his opponents loses a life, and he adds another counter to his clock. Foil and Gavin then both draw their cards on Fog's upkeep while Fog untaps and then draws for turn. Fog plays a Swamp for turn and then goes to recast his Ichor Rat, which then gets countered by Foil with a Mana Drain. Each opponent then loses a life and Foil gains another life and adds another counter to his clock. Fog then pays 3 and casts Vraska's Fall, which has each of his opponents sacrificing a creature or planeswalker and then gives him another poison counter. He then goes to combat, swinging his Might at Foil and his Attendant at Eric, who both don't block and get more poison counters. On Eric's upkeep, Foil's clock goes off while Eric plays a Bloodstained Mire for turn. Foil then goes and shuffles his graveyard and hand back into his library, where Eric cracks his Bloodstained Mire in order to go get a land from his library. Eric then pays a 2 life to play an untapped Stomping Ground and casts a 3 visits, while Foil then draws 7 new cards. Eric then pays an additional 2 life to play an untapped Temple Garden, which he uses in order to cast a Birds of Paradise. Foil plays a Scalding Tarn for turn and then pays the 1 life to sack it in order to go get a Watery Grave from his library, which he pays a 2 life for to bring into play untapped. Eric then gingerly cuts Foil's deck before he then pays 6 to recast his commander Rusko again, which has him creating another Midnight Clock when he enters play. Foil then casts an Athalia Smuggler and passes turn. Gavin plays a Savannah for turn and then casts Alonda the Dusk Rose, which creates him another Vampire token which deals 2 damage to each of his opponents when they enter play. He then casts a Deadly Dispute, sacking his Vampire token in order to draw 2 cards and create himself a Treasure token. Fog plays another Swamp for turn and then pays 4 to cast his commander Ria Ivor. Fog then goes to combat, targeting his attendant with his commander's ability before he then swings him at Eric. This damage then gets prevented and Fog creates 3 new Might tokens. Eric draws and casts a Horn of Greed for turn. On his end step, Foil casts a Displace, targeting his Smuggler and his commander, which adds a counter to his clock and has each of his opponents losing a life while he gains a life. He then flickers both of his cards, slamming them down back on the table, which creates him another Midnight Clock. On his upkeep, Foil adds counters to both of his clocks before he then draws for turn. He then plays a Temple of Deceit for turn and scries 1 card, putting it onto the bottom of his library. He then draws off his Horn Trigger and casts a Phyrexian Metamorph, which he has come into play as another Midnight Clock. Gavin plays a Graven Carnage for turn and then pays to cast a Changeling Outcast, which has him creating a Vampire token when he enters play, dealing 2 damage to each of his opponents. Gavin then tries to cast an Austerior Command in order to destroy all the creatures, before Foil counters it with a Force of Negation. Gavin then casts a Village Rites in order to sack his Changeling Outcast and draw 2 cards, before he then decides he'd rather sack his token instead of his Outcast. Gavin then pays 6 life into his Necropotence and then passes his turn. Fog draws for turn while Foil adds more counters to his clock and then he plays the Seed Core. He then draws off the Horn Trigger and casts a Gulping Scrap Trap, which proliferates each of his opponent's poison counters when it enters play. He then casts a Mirror Convert before paying the 1 mana in order to equip his commander with the Injector. Fog then goes to combat, once again targeting his attendant with his commander's ability. He then swings his commander Gavin, his attendant and Eric, and his 4 Might tokens at Foil. Gavin then chump blocks with his Outcast, while Foil blocks with 2 of his creatures, but still ends up taking 4 damage and gets 2 more poison counters, and Eric decides not to block, giving Fog more Might tokens. On his upkeep, Foil adds more counters to his clocks while Eric draws for turn. He then pays 3 and casts Azusa Lost But Seeking. This then allows Eric to play 2 additional lands on his turn, which in turn allows Eric to bounce a Boros back to his hand and play 2 times in order to draw 2 cards, before he then is able to play an actual land for turn, drawing a 3rd card. On his upkeep, Foil puts more counters on his clocks before drawing for turn and playing an island. He then casts a Thassa Deep Dwelling before he casts a Ghostly Flicker, adding more counters to his clocks, dealing damage to each of his opponents and flickering his commander in order to create another Midnight Clock. He then goes to his end step and uses this Thassa trigger to flicker his commander 1 more time, creating another Midnight Clock. On Gavin's upkeep, 1 of Foil's clocks goes off, so he shuffles his deck, his hand, and graveyard together, while Gavin casts a Voldaren Epicature. This then has him creating another Vampire token when he enters play and has each of his opponents losing a total of 3 life, before he then casts a Cordial Vampire, creating another token and dealing 2 more damage to his opponents. Foil then draws a fresh 7 cards while Gavin casts a Captivating Vampire, dealing 2 more damage to each of his opponents. Gavin then taps 5 of his vampires in order to try to gain control of Foil's commander, and in response, Foil casts Teferi's Time Twister. This then has Foil flickering his commander, which brings him back into play with a 1/1 counter and deals 1 damage to each of his opponents. Fog plays a Plains for turn and then draws a card off the Horn Trigger. He then casts a Norn's Annex before he then casts Skrelv, Defective Might. Fog then goes to combat and targets a Scrap Trap with his commander's ability, before he then swings his commander and all 6 of his mights at Gavin, his mirror and Scrap Trap at Eric, and then his attendant at Foil. Eric then blocks both the creatures coming at him, Foil blocks the one creature attacking him, and Gavin decides to block as many of the creatures as he can before he then gets taken out by poison damage. On Eric's upkeep, Foil goes through the monotonous task of adding counters to all of his clocks, before Eric then pays to cast his commander Omnath, Locus of Creation. Eric then draws a card when he enters play and plays a land for turn, drawing an additional card. On Foil's upkeep, one of his clocks then goes off and he goes through the same routine of shuffling his hand and graveyard and library together before drawing 7 new cards. He then draws for turn and plays an island before drawing an additional card. Foil then casts a Spark Double, which comes into play as a copy of his commander, which creates him another Midnight Clock when he enters play. Foil then casts a Displace, targeting a Spark Double in his commander. We're pretty sure at this time that they both enter play at the same time, which allows Spark Double to become a copy of his commander once again, creating him 2 more Midnight Clocks, but more importantly, this deals enough damage to Eric to take him out of the game. One of his clocks then goes off, which has him doing the same song and dance of shuffling his hand, graveyard, and library together before he then draws 7 new cards. He then casts a Sword of Hearth and Home before paying to equip it to his commander. After this, he then uses his Thassa trigger to flicker a Spark Double, having it come back into play as Rusko, creating him another Midnight Clock token. Fog draws for turn and then casts a Kicked but Knowledge Sleeper. This then has Foil sacrificing his Spark Double, while Fog sacrifices his Scrap Trap, which then has him proliferating Foil's poison counters. Fog then decides to go to combat, swinging out with all of his creatures at Foil. Foil realizes he doesn't have enough blockers and then ends up dying to poison damage. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you can see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.